the Forbidden Blender.
Maggie got into her car and switched on the radio. She drove out of the parking lot of her office building and onto the street. With 20 minutes gone and the lights of the city behind, she turned off the highway by a familiar exit. Eventually, the paved road she was on was flanked by tall, thin trees, their weak little branches arcing over her car as they seemed to grasp uselessly at the teasing moon hanging low overhead. She hummed along mindlessly to the music, something late 80s, Tom Petty maybe. As she barreled down the street, she took a turn onto the dirt road a little too quickly, and mud splashed up onto her windshield from the rain the night before. She flipped the switch on her wipers to wick away the mud and tiny branches that were kicked up. The small light up ahead let her know that she was seconds away from home. When she pulled into her driveway, he was there, standing, staring at the house. His fitted shirt was torn, and the bouquet of flowers in his hand dangled precariously. She sat in the car, fuming. No matter how many times she told him to leave, he followed. No matter how many times she moved, he followed. No matter how many times she screamed at him, he followed. She'd already paid in full for the next 2 months' rent. They couldn't move again for at least half a year. She got out of the car and marched over to him, stopping inches from his face. "Bobby, you're wasting your time. What we had is over. You need to leave." His eyes were circled from what looked like lack of sleep. His head moved slowly, turning to her. A flicker of recognition darted across his eyes. He smiled. "Hey, Maggie. How you been? Can I see Ruby Sue?" "She's sleeping. But even if she was wide awake, you know you can't see her. Are you even listening to me?" His eyes moved up and down her face, slowly. "So, is Ruby Sue up, Maggie? I'd really like to see my baby girl." Maggie gave up and left Bobby standing there, flowers and all. She set down her purse and poured herself a glass of wine. As much as she wanted to down the bottle, she stuck with the one glass. She crept across the hallway, trying her best to stay silent. "Mama?" A small voice came from behind the closed door to her right. Maggie swore silently under her breath. She creaked open the door marked Princess Ruby Sue. As she entered, she was greeted by the familiar kaleidoscope of color and feathers. A small girl was bolt upright in bed. Maggie sat down beside her on the bed and wrapped the crazy tangle of hair and PJs in her arms. "Do we have to move again?" the little girl asked, her voice slightly trembling. "Oh no, sweetheart, no. Why would you think such a thing? 'Cause whenever you talk to somebody outside at night, that means we're gonna move soon." Maggie's eyes widened slightly. No, sweetheart. Sometimes your mama gets lonely and talks to herself." "Did you talk to yourself before Daddy died?" It's getting late, sweetheart, and you got school tomorrow." "But Mama..." "No buts, young lady. Good night." Maggie tucked her daughter in and gave her a kiss on the forehead. She exited her daughter's room and closed the door behind her. She stood there in the hallway, fighting back tears. She thought back to lying in the hospital bed, frantically asking where her husband was. She thought back to their plans discussing how if labor started while he was at work, to just meet at the hospital. She thought back to all the times he said he'd never, ever leave her. She thought back to how much she loved daffodils. She thought of how the little shop on the other side of town always carried daffodils that looked like they came out of a storybook. She thought of how distracted her husband could get while driving. She thought back to her exhausted body staying awake just long enough to see the police officer with a face pitched with pity talking to the nurse. Maggie sat down in the kitchen and sobbed as quietly as she could. She grabbed her purse off the countertop and pulled a crumbling piece of paper out of one of its small pockets. It was a receipt for 12 daffodils, dated 8 years ago. She stared out the window. Bobby was still out there in the exact same spot, staring. As the clouds blocking it moved, the moon shone down onto their tiny plot of land. Bobby's form twitched and seemed to fade in and out like static on an old TV. In a decision that almost tore her heart out, she pulled out her lighter and set the ancient receipt ablaze. She watched with tears streaming down her face as Bobby's form was engulfed in flames. In the other room, Ruby Sue almost woke up when warmth flooded her body, emanating from a kiss on her forehead that seemed to come from nowhere.